Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Staffing shortfalls and ballooning oversight duties are straining the USDA's ability to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. A Supreme Court ruling now blocks the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service from issuing fines despite repeated violations, and outsourcing inspections isn't a good option. Here to break down the impact is Director of the Animal Law and Policy Institute at Vermont Law and Graduate School, Delciana Winders. Ms. Winders, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We're going to talk about a couple of interesting topics here. Animal welfare and the role of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS. Let me start first by asking you, there's a couple of problems going on here. Let's start with staffing. What's going on with staffing in APHIS, and why does it have you so concerned?
So APHIS has a really big responsibility for overseeing research facilities, zoos, wholesale pet breeders and dealers. And so they oversee 17.5 thousand facilities with more than 1 million animals. And historically, they've had about 120 inspectors to handle that. And that was already not enough people, and there were longstanding problems. But now we've seen a precipitous decline. We have only 77 inspectors, which is the lowest that I've seen it in the couple decades that I've been working on this. And what that means is that facilities aren't being inspected. When complaints are filed about concerns, they're not being followed up on. When serious violations that are causing suffering happen, the USDA isn't following up to make sure that they've been corrected.
But this downsizing is not just a recent date. It's been coming for a while. What's been leading to the reduction in staff in APHIS?
Yeah, so there has been a gradual decline over years. There was a precipitous increase this year, but there have been morale issues with the agency for many years. So the agency's enforcement of the law has been very poor. Its own Office of Inspector General has repeatedly condemned it as inadequate. And so inspectors get to a point where they're reporting up the line serious violations that are hurting animals, and then they see that nothing is done. And so some will leave and some will stay and just stop issuing those citations. It got worse around 2016, 2017, 2018, under the leadership of Bernadette Juarez, where numerous staff suggested that it was a toxic environment, that they were instructed to remove citations from inspection reports, and a lot of people left then.
What kinds of things are these inspectors looking for? You mentioned a variety of facilities, everything from zoos to research facilities and transporters. What are they looking for? What governs their inspection?
Yeah, so they're not specialized, and they're looking at, as you said, a large number of and type of facilities, and also a lot of different kinds of animals. So, primates, rabbits, guinea pigs, bats, dogs, etc., elephants. And so there are minimal regulatory standards to provide minimum care for animals. So they're not particularly demanding. They require adequate space, for example. They require adequate veterinary care. And so the inspectors are looking for compliance with these baseline humane standards.
What is the impact then on the animals? If these inspectors can really only respond on a complaint basis because of the demand that they have, what's happening to the animals kind of across all of those different sorts of facilities?
Animals are suffering. It's as basic as that. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture Office of Inspector General just earlier this year issued an audit report in which they said because of staffing, USDA is not following up on inspections. It's not doing complete inspections. It's not timely doing inspections, and animal well-being is what is on the line here. And that was before this precipitous decline that we saw this year. The Congressional Research Service also has indicated that if we see any further staffing cuts, again, from where it was earlier, there are likely to be more problems with animal welfare.
I'm speaking with Dulciana Winders. She's the director of the Animal Law and Policy Institute at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Well, let's follow on with that. If you have 77 inspectors for 17,000 sites, they're covering over 200 sites per person.
Yep.
Already there aren't enough days in the week for them to do their work.
Right, exactly.
But there was a recent Supreme Court decision that has further reduced their ability to really enforce the laws when they can inspect. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called Securities Exchange Commission versus Jarkissi, ruled that the SEC couldn't assess fines for securities fraud itself. It had to go through the Department of Justice and go through a full jury trial. And so agencies across the federal government have these sort of systems in place where they assess fines with administrative law judges. And it's very routine and it makes things more efficient. I mean, it's still quite slow and there have been problems with that. But the Supreme Court said the agency couldn't do it itself. Now, it's not decided whether that applies to the Animal Welfare Act. There are very important ways in which the Animal Welfare Act is distinct from securities fraud. And the reasons the court ruled it the way it did is because securities fraud was a crime at the time. There was a cause of action at the time the country was founded. You were entitled to a jury trial. Animal protection, of course, was not on anybody's radar then. And it's really something that's in the public interest. And in fact, a court ruled just a few weeks ago in the context of the Horse Protection Act, which is a very similar statute, that Jarkissi does not apply. Nevertheless, the USDA has been, I would say, overly cautious. And since that decision, it has not been assessing fines, which were its primary means of enforcing the law. And for research facilities, the only means of enforcing the law.
So if you're one of these facilities and you can reasonably bet that an inspector is not going to show up at your door anytime soon, and if you did violate the law, you're not going to have to pay a penalty for that, what does that tell you about the enforcement culture and the risk?
Yeah, I mean, it tells you basically that facilities have carte blanche to violate the law, and they know that. Even before, when fines were being assessed, they were being heavily discounted to pennies on the dollar. The Inspector General repeatedly said they were treated as a cost of doing business by industry. And now those are off the table. And we know that the USDA takes the attitude that the regulated facilities, or the facilities it's supposed to regulate, are customers to whom it provides services. And so there's really no prioritization of bringing people into compliance with the law and protecting animals, which is the purpose of the law.
One of the ideas that's been floated is that APHIS could outsource its inspections to a third party. What's your sense about whether that is a viable alternative to improve the enforcement?
I think that would make things worse, actually. So the USDA formally proposed that some years ago, and there was massive opposition. They went through a notice and comment process, they had hearings, and there was massive opposition. And so they said, we're not going to do that. Then they turned around and secretly did it with research facilities that were accredited by an industry organization called ALAC. They were doing reduced inspection. So rather than looking at facilities, records, and animals, they told the inspector, if they're accredited by ALAC, just pick one of those and just look at that. So animals might not even be looked at. And the problem is ALAC facilities don't have higher rates of compliance with the Animal Welfare Act. There have been numerous analyses that have found that in some instances their records are worse.
So as you've been studying this challenge for a couple of decades, as you say, what are your recommendations, either in terms of policy, regulation, enforcement, that would really improve the welfare of the animals in these facilities?
I mean, in the short term, we need Congress to allocate more resources and to demand that the USDA increase its staffing level. Its number of facilities that it oversees has more than doubled, and yet they have a decline in inspectors. And so the regulations require that regulated entities have sufficient staffing, but the USDA itself doesn't have that. However, this is really symptomatic of a much bigger, more long-standing problem, which is that the USDA is not an agency that prioritizes animal welfare. It's an agency that promotes American agriculture, which oftentimes involves animals. And so it's not surprising that it has a record over decades of failing to adequately enforce these laws. In fact, at the time the Animal Welfare Act was enacted, it begged Congress not to give responsibility for that statute to it. So really what we need is an animal protection agency that has a sole mandate, who's focused entirely on animal welfare and doesn't come into these conflicts of interest.
And that would include not just these kind of research facilities and zoos and circuses, but perhaps also the agricultural industry, animals, cattle, pigs, chickens, those kinds of things?
Well, we don't have a federal law governing oversight of animals on farm. A lot of people don't realize that. There is no regulation of animals who are raised for food, except for during transport and at slaughter. So those things, those federal laws, yes, should be given to an animal protection agency as well, because those laws also have been very poorly enforced.
I've been speaking with Delciana Winders. She's the director of the Animal Law and Policy Institute at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Thank you so much for giving us some clarity about this issue.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.